They thought it was funny, laughing at a blind man and mocking the dog that guided him. But the moment they circled too close, everything changed. That pet wasn't just a guide. It was a military-trained K9 with scars and a record service overseas. One soft word from its master, and the gang learned silence the hard way. By the end, engines that once roared with arrogance left quiet, and the town's ledger wrote down what everyone saw: respect replacing mockery. What did that dog do that left an entire gang retreating in fear? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The corner where Maine and Ash met was not much to look at. A weathered bench sat near the rusted pole of the bus stop sign, the paint on its surface long since flaked away by winters that never forgave steel or wood. A blind man sat there with his cane resting lightly against his right leg, his hand folded across the curve of its handle as though it were part of him. His eyes, pale and clouded, carried the stillness of someone who no longer saw the world, but understood its movements better than most. Beside him sat a dog, tall and lean, its coat a deep shade of black with a faint sheen that caught the weak afternoon light. The dog's head was lifted, ears twitching toward every sound, but its body did not shift or stir. It was a posture of discipline, silent readiness that did not need to prove itself. The street around them was ordinary for a town this size. A diner across the way offered the smell of frying oil and coffee, while the hardware store's faded sign hung crooked, its owner too old to care about replacing it. A bus would not arrive for another 20 minutes, but the man had come early, as he always did. Routine was his measured time, the cane tapping the pavement in steady beats, the dog leading him by memory and scent rather than guesswork. He knew which cracks in the sidewalk leaned deeper than others, which traffic light buzzed faintly before changing. To him, the bench was not simply a place to sit. It was a marker in the pattern of his day, a place where silence belonged. The dog shifted its weight slightly, not restless but attentive, as if counting the cars rolling past. Its harness, worn but well-kept, bore a brass clip dulled by years of touch. The engraving had faded, but to someone who looked close, there were numbers and letters that did not belong to ordinary pets. Few ever noticed. To most, it was just another service dog guiding, just another man who lived on the margins of attention. That was how the man preferred it. Quiet, unremarked upon, steady as the cane at his side. People who walked by often slowed for a moment, curiosity flickering in their eyes before habit pushed them forward. Some glanced at the blind man with a mix of pity and discomfort, unsure whether to offer help he did not need. Others smiled at the dog, assuming it was nothing more than a companion trained to stop him from stepping into traffic. They did not see the way the animal's gaze fixed on every moving piece of street, nor how its breathing matched the rhythm of the man's cane. They did not hear the almost imperceptible clicks of its jaw when a stranger came too close. It was easier to assume what was simple: a blind man waiting for a bus, a loyal dog beside him. Nothing more. The man sat unmoving, face tilted toward the faint warmth of the sun that slipped between drifting clouds. He listened to the world as others did not. The hiss of air brakes 2 streets over told him the bus was still on its route. The shuffle of shoes against gravel across the street told him someone had stepped outside the diner to light a cigarette. The dog did not stir at these sounds. It had heard them all before. Only when a motorcycle's low hum drifted faintly from blocks away did the animal's ears perk higher, its muscles tightening just enough for the man to feel it through the leather harness. He gave a small nod, a movement so slight it might have been missed entirely. But the dog settled again, though its ears remained forward. For now, the corner was calm, as it often was. The bench bore the weight of man and animal alike, and the afternoon stretched without hurry. There was no spectacle here, no noise beyond the rhythm of town life. Yet beneath the stillness lay something unspoken, a readiness waiting in silence. The man's fingers tapped once against the cane, and the dog's tail brushed the ground a single time. To those who walked past, it was nothing worth noticing. To those who would linger long enough, it was a quiet discipline of 2 lives bound by more than necessity, a partnership forged elsewhere, carried here, hidden in plain sight. The sound came before the sight. At first, it was only a faint vibration carried along the cracked asphalt, a low hum that thickened into a growl. Main Street had its own rhythm, Delivery trucks rattling near the diner, the buzz of old sedans heading toward the outskirts, the occasional honk that carried impatience more than danger. But this sound cut different. The growl deepened, multiplied, grew into a rolling thunder that filled the narrow street with its echo. People inside the diner looked up from their plates before they even understood why. The dog at the blind man's side lifted its head, ears cutting sharp toward the west where the engine swelled. They came in a stagger line at first, then closer together as the road narrowed. Black jackets, patched sleeves, chrome flashing dully beneath the overcast sky. Tires pressed into the pavement with confidence that wasn't earned by rules but by arrogance, the kind that dared the street to tell them no. Each rider leaned into the sound of his own machine, revving louder than the last, a contest that nobody else had agreed to join. The echo bounced against the glass storefronts, rattling the hardware store's loose sign and shaking the quiet from the afternoon. At the corner of Main and Ash, the man on the bench did not move. His cane rested against his leg just as it had minutes before, and his eyes, pale and unseeing, did not flicker toward the noise. But the dog at his feet tensed, its body lowering slightly as if the air itself had changed weight. To anyone watching, it was a reaction of an animal startled by sound. To those who knew better, it was the posture of a creature trained not to flee but to measure distance, speed, and threat. Its breathing grew sharper, then steadied, a controlled adjustment made not by instinct but by long practice. The gang slowed as they approached the corner. Engines sputtered into deeper growls, then quieted just enough to hear boots dragging against the pavement as they rolled their bikes into a loose circle. The leader, a broad man with sunburnt skin and mirror glasses, cut his engine entirely, and the others followed like echoes in sequence. The sudden silence fell heavier than the noise had been, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the faint hiss of exhaust. Their laughter filled the gap, coarse and careless, bouncing off the brick walls of the diner and the drugstores as they owned the air itself. Shops that lined Main Street carried the stillness of people waiting, the kind of silence that kept curtains from being pulled back and doors from being opened. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve near the diner window, but she hushed him quickly, eyes pressed downward toward her coffee. It was not the first time the engines had rattled the quiet out of town, and it would not be the last. The gang carried itself like weather, loud, disruptive, and temporary, but weather could still break things before it passed. The blind man tilted his head slightly, not toward the gang but toward the sound of the engines cooling, the faint metallic tick he recognized from long ago. He said nothing. His hand remained on the cane, his posture unchanged. The dog's tail brushed once against the ground, its head fixed in the direction of the boot, scraping closer. The corner had shifted. The routine of a man waiting for a bus was now set against a circle of riders who had entered not for travel, but for amusement. The street seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what they would make of the still figure on the bench and the animal at his side. The first laugh came sharp, sudden, and mean. It broke the silence the engines had left behind, carried by a man with grease-streaked hands and a crooked grin who jabbed a finger toward the dog. "Look at that little soldier," he sneered, his voice loud enough to carry across the whole corner. His finger pointed not at the man with the cane, but at the harness strapped across the dog's back. Leather, worn and darkened by time, with a brass clip that caught the gray light. To him, it was nothing but decoration, something silly, something that invited mockery. The others joined quickly, laughter spilling out in uneven bursts, overlapping and raw. Boots shuffled on the pavement as shoulders leaned forward, each man taking permission from the first to jeer louder. "Dogs walking him like a leash," another said. Some wore Hero's babysitter. A third added, tugging at his own jacket strap, as if the harness were a joke fit for the street. The blind man did not move. His head stayed tilted slightly upward, eyes unfocused, face still as stone. To them, his silence looked like helplessness. To his dog, it was a signal that nothing had changed. The animal did not flinch under the noise. Its ears tracked the voices, flicking with precision from one sound to the next. Its head turned slightly when Boots scuffed closer, its muscles tightening only enough to be felt through the leather strap the man held. It was not the trembling of fear, but the calculation of distance. Every gesture it made was deliberate. The laughter grew bolder. One man slapped another on the shoulder, repeating the joke of the leash. this time miming the blind man being pulled across the street like a rag doll. The circle of amusement swelled, each laugh chasing the last until the corner felt crowded by it. Across the street, behind the diner glass, someone lowered their eyes, not wanting to be caught watching. The waitress with her order pad froze at the sound. The pen paused above paper. Everyone recognized the tone. It was not humor that built from joy, but the kind that grew from cruelty. The sort of laughter that waited for a target and had found one in an old man and his dog. The blind man's hand shifted only slightly on the head of his cane, a small adjustment that looked like nothing at all. The dog's breathing slowed to an even rhythm, its eyes fixed on the loudest of the men, the one who had first pointed, watching his hand gesture through space. A faint scar cut across the dog's left ear, a mark that none of the bikers noticed, but one that told of explosions and shrapnel in another life. To the men in leather and boots, it was only much trained to keep an old man from walking into traffic. Weakness was all they saw. Weakness was all they believed. The laughter ebbed and surged, filling the quiet of the corner as if to push everything else out. One man leaned back on his bike and let out a whistle, the kind used to mock, not to call. Another clapped his hands slowly, as though congratulating the dog for playing its role. The blind man's face remained calm, expressionless, lips pressed together in a line that betrayed neither anger nor fear. His dog, steady at his side, blinked once, then locked eyes again on the movement in front of it. The street, the bench, the bus sign, none of it moved. Only the sound carried. Sharp laughter from men who believed themselves in control. They thought they had found comedy in leather straps and a brass clip. They thought they had found a victim. The man did not rise, and the dog did not break posture. Together, they sat in silence that did not resist and did not surrender. The first laugh still hung in the air, echoing longer than any of the men expected, its weight heavier than they understood. The laughter washed over the corner like a tide that refused to pull back, coarse and careless, each voice feeding off the next. Boots scuffed closer, metal buckles rattled. The smell of cigarettes and gasoline thickened in the air. The blind man sat unmoving, his clouded eyes fixed ahead as though he neither heard nor cared. Then, without a word, his right hand shifted. The cane, resting lightly against his leg, lifted just enough to leave the bench. He lowered it with single, firm tap against the pavement. The sound was small, barely louder than a finger against a table, yet it cut through the jeering with precision. The men noticed, but did not understand. One of them chuckled and mimicked the sound with his boot, stomping once on the ground in mockery. Another whistled sharply, turning the single tap into the punchline of their amusement. The blind man's face gave no reaction. His jaw stayed firm, his lips pressed in a line neither smiling nor frowning. It was as if he had not heard them at all. The cane remained upright, held lightly but steady, angled toward the ground as if its sole purpose was to measure space. At his side, the dog shifted. Not much. A lean forward, paws stretching slightly as if preparing to rise. Its head tilted, ears forward, eyes locked with the precision of a lens. It had not moved when the laughter began, nor when bottles rattled against the pavement, but the single tap carried weight. The harness creaked softly as the dog placed more of its body forward, steadying against the ground. Its breathing slowed, controlled, the rise and fall of its chest sinking to something only it and the man understood. The bikers noticed the animal's posture, but their minds turned it into the shape of a joke. "Oh, look," one said, his voice thick with amusement. "The mutt thinks it's scary." He leaned closer, making a low growl to mock it. Another reached down and rapped the bench twice with his knuckles, echoing the tap of the cane. They expected fear, flinching, retreat. None came. The dog's gaze tracked every sound, its body perfectly still except for the forward lean that put it between its master and the boots edging nearer. The blind man's hand did not tighten. His body did not tense. His stillness was its own kind of command. Around them, the street seemed to shift quieter. A passing car slowed, its driver glancing once before speeding off again. The waitress at the diner door held her tray motionless, eyes fixed across the street. Everyone knew what the cane meant to a blind man: guidance, support, balance. But in that moment, the single push of it against concrete felt more like a signal. The laughter began to waver, the edges thinning. A few of the bikers glanced at each other, uncertain why such a small act unsettled them. It was only a tap, after all. Yet the dog's response was undeniable. The animal wasn't cowering. It wasn't confused. It was waiting. Every breath it took seemed wound tight around that small sound. The man's face gave nothing away, but his silence carried more weight than words. The tap echoed again in memory, as if the concrete had stored it. A command that did not need to be spoken. A signal that did not need to be explained. The cane rested once more against the man's leg. His hand folded over it in calm possession. The bikers, still grinning but less sure now, stood around the bench in a ring that no longer felt like victory. The dogs leaned forward, held steady, unbroken, as though it alone knew what would come next. The corner remained suspended in that silence, the world listening for a second tap that had not yet come. The dog's harness looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know how to look. Worn leather, thick and dark, shaped by years of use until it bent naturally with the animal's movements. The stitching had frayed in places but held strong, the kind of handwork that outlasted factory-made straps. Across its center, where the harness curved along the shoulder blades, a brass clip caught the pale light. At first glance it was nothing, just a dull shine dulled further by age, the sort of thing most people would walk past without notice. The bikers didn't see it, not really. To them, it was only a leash, a tool that made the old man dependent. Their eyes skimmed over brass and leather, blind in their own way. Yet the clip carried history. Its engraving was shallow but deliberate, a series of numbers and letters, etched with precision not for ornament but for identification. The numbers had been rubbed by years of handling, but they still held their shape, sharp enough that a practiced eye could read them. Those numbers once matched the files stored in the government armory, pages that tracked training hours, missions, deployments. A single unit code that marked the dog not as pet, not as property, but as soldier. The leather had seen more than sidewalks and bus stops. It had been pulled tight under desert suns, soaked in rain that turned fields of mud, brushed by dust storms that erased the horizon. The harness had been clipped and unclipped with gloved hands in the dark, seconds before a breach, seconds after an explosion. Each scratch along the brass clip was not from accident, but from living through work no ordinary animal was ever meant to carry. The mark of service was there for anyone who cared to see. The bikers did not. Their eyes were fixed on laughter, on their own voices echoing in the corner. The dog stood steady in it, shoulders square beneath the leather's weight, as though the harness was part of its body. Its chest lifted slowly, nostrils flaring not with fear, but with awareness, cataloging the scents around it. The oil from the bikes, the tang of cigarette smoke, the salt of sweat from the men crowding too close. Its eyes never broke focus. Its ears flicked, but the rest of its body was still, trained to hold until released. The clip caught the weak sun again, a flicker that went unnoticed. The blind man's hand rested just at the harness strap, the same way it always had. His fingers brushed against the numbers, not to read them. He didn't need to. He already knew what they meant. His touch was more like acknowledgement, a silent recognition of what brought him here, of what had been shared between them long before this street, long before this moment. He did not need his eyes to see the brass. He had carried it through memory, each tap of cane echoing the rhythm of commands once shouted on sand and stone. To the bikers, it was still nothing. They laughed louder, mocked louder, circling like men who thought they understood power. They had not seen how soldiers marked their animals, how every number etched on brass meant survival, meant trust, meant years of work no cruelty could erase. The collar's mark waited quietly, unnoticed by those who should have paid attention. And in its silence, it carried the weight of history heavier than any engine growl or careless laugh could ever match. Engines clicked into silence one by one, each machine settling with the sound of cooling metal and faint hisses of exhaust. The thunder that had rolled through the street moments earlier was gone, leaving only the heavy presence of the men themselves. Boots scraped against the pavement as riders swung legs over their bikes and moved forward. The scrape carried weight, steel against stone, rubber dragging dust. The corner seemed smaller now, the space around the bench folding inward as bodies filled it. They did not rush. Confidence let them move slowly, spreading wide enough to block every side, a loose ring forming without a word exchanged. The blind man remained still, cane angled against his leg, the dog steady at his feet. To anyone watching from the diner windows, it looked uneven, an old man who could not see, flanked by a single animal, surrounded by men built broad and loud, men whose boots and jackets spoke of power worn carelessly. The first words were half muttered, half laugh, directed at the man's silence. "Does he even hear us?" One asked, leaning forward as if his voice might force a reaction. Another answered with a chuckle, "He don't need to hear. The mutt will tell him." More laughter spilled, not sharp but rolling, each man joining until the corner carried it. One of them dragged the toe of his boot against the curb, slow and deliberate, circling a small groove into the concrete as though marking territory. Another pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, blowing the smoke toward the bench. It drifted into the dog's fur, but the animal did not flinch, only flicked an ear toward the sound of the lighter's click. The blind man's hand did not rise, his face did not shift. His stillness became part of the bench itself, a fixture the gang mistook for weakness. The circle closed tighter. They were not yet within reach, but close enough that the sound of their jackets creaking could be heard, close enough that the scent of oil and leather carried heavy in the air. The man's dog shifted one paw forward, a subtle realignment that placed its body between its master and the nearest shadow. The bikers did not notice the movement, or if they did, they dismissed it. To them, the dog was only reacting like any animal would when surrounded. "Should put that mutt on a leash," someone joked, and another echoed him, twisting the words into a crueler laugh. A third reached out his arm as if to touch the harness, but stopped short, pulling back his hand only to slap the shoulder of the man beside him, feeding the rhythm of mockery. The gang spoke louder now, each man raising his voice over the other, as if volume alone could prove their dominance. Still, the blind man sat. His head remained slightly tilted upward, his clouded eyes turned toward a faint warmth of the sun filtering through gray clouds. He gave them nothing, not a twitch, not a frown, not a word. His silence unnerved some, though they covered it with louder laughter, pretending not to feel how the moment stretched. The dog's breath was slow, measured, rising and falling like a metronome against the man's leg. The ring was complete now, engines behind them, laughter in front of them. The circle of men closed around a bench that had been nothing more than wood and steel minutes before, but now felt like a stage. Onlookers did not step forward, but eyes pressed against glass, ears strained to catch the sound. The bikers thought they had trapped a blind man and his animal. They did not see the calm in his stillness, or the way the dog's muscles coiled beneath the worn leather harness, waiting, silent, already measuring the distance between the boots and the bench. The ring of men pressed closer, their voices overlapping in waves of mockery, their boots dragging on the pavement in restless arcs. The sound of laughter rolled heavy in the air, but the dog at the blind man's side did not tremble, did not shrink. Its posture was steady, chest lifted, front paws planted firmly, head slightly raised. The animal's stillness was not the frozen pause of fear, but the grounded readiness of discipline. Every sound in the circle landed inside its ears as if catalogued, measured, and stored. The faint scrape of leather, the shift of weight in boots, the rattle of chain from one biker's belt. Each was marked without reaction. One man leaned forward, snapping his fingers an inch too close, expecting a startle. The dog's eyes locked on the movement, following it with precision, pupils sharp and unblinking. There was no flinch, no recoil, no attempt to retreat. The biker smirked, though it faltered when he realized the stare was not broken by distraction. "Weird mutt," he muttered, pulling his hand back with shake as though dismissing what he felt. The blind man sat still, one hand resting lightly on the cane, the other on the harness strap that ran across the dog's back. His fingers brushed the leather as if to confirm the presence he already knew was there. He said nothing. His silence was not the silence of weakness, but of someone who did not need to speak. The dog was already speaking in its way, through its stillness, through its refusal to acknowledge noise as threat. Most animals would have shifted by now, ears folding back, body curling toward protection. This dog did not. Its ears remained upright, tilting just slightly with every voice that broke the air. Its nostrils flared, drawing in smoke, sweat, gasoline, the layered scent of men who carried too much arrogance and not enough caution. Its chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, each breath measured, unhurried. The calm unnerved one man who had crouched down to meet the animal's gaze directly. He held it for only a moment before looking away, muttering under his breath, "Something's off with this one." His voice was low, quieter than the laughter around him, but it carried to the ears of those nearest. A few chuckled at his unease, brushing it off his nerves, though their grins tightened. The dog's eyes followed him as he straightened, never once shifting to the others, as though marking him above the rest. The biker avoided the stare now, glancing instead at his companions, pretending interest in their jokes. The animal's body did not tremble, even when a boot scuffed inches from its paw. It did not bare teeth, did not growl, did not warn. The discipline in its restraint was sharper than aggression would have been. It was a kind of calm that belonged to something trained for precision, not impulse. To the gang, it looked unnatural. To the man who held the cane, it was the clearest sign of loyalty. The street seemed to notice too. The laughter, once bold, began to ripple instead of roar, some voices trailing into nervous chuckles. The town's silence pressed closer through the windows of the diner, through the half-cracked door of the hardware store, through the eyes of people who were not sure whether they were watching mockery or the slow build of something else entirely. The dog remained motionless, only its gaze alive, as if it knew patience was its sharpest weapon. The biker who muttered found his own laughter gone, his hand twitching against his side, unsettled by an animal that should have cowered but instead stared through him like it had already decided where he would stand when the moment turned. The ring had grown tighter, the laughter louder, as if the men needed their own voices to reassure themselves of control. The blind man stayed fixed at the bench, his hand resting lightly on the cane, his face offering no sign of reaction. It was a dog they wanted now, the animal they thought easier to provoke, easier to bend into their game. One biker, broad-shouldered and smirking, leaned forward with exaggerated bravado. He hunched low, clapping his hand suddenly just inches from the dog's head, the sound sharp and meant to startle. The dog did not move. Its body remained perfectly still, muscles steady beneath the harness, eyes locked on the biker's shape as though reading his intention before it formed. The animal's ears twitched once, aligning toward the sound, but there was no recoil, no snap of surprise. The man expected a flinch, maybe a bark, perhaps a retreat toward its master. None came. Instead, the dog's head followed the biker's hand as it withdrew, its gaze like a blade tracing every fraction of motion. The precision unsettled him in a way he had not expected. He laughed to cover it, a sharp, forced sound that called the others to join in. See that? Much too dumb to even know when it's being scared. The others barked with him, throwing back their heads, slapping one another's shoulders. Yet a few glanced at the dog longer than before, noticing that its eyes never broke contact, that its posture was not slack, but tuned like a spring held by invisible restraint. The blind man did not shift. He kept his chin tilted toward the pale light in the sky, lips pressed in the same flat line, his hand resting calm at the harness strap. The dog's breathing was steady, chest rising and falling in slow cadence. It was not ignoring the biker. It was watching him with focus that felt surgical, as though the man were being weighed and measured. The biker leaned forward again, closer this time, snapping his fingers just near the dog's ear. The dog's head turned smoothly, eyes following the sound with exact alignment, no delay, no hesitation. Precision, like a machine that had learned to map the world in movement and sound. "Creepy mutt," the biker muttered under his breath, though his grin stayed on his face for the others to see. He reached one hand out as though to ruffle the fur, stopping short at the last moment, pulling it back with a laugh. The dog had tracked the gesture from start to finish, every tendon in its neck shifting in exact response. It had not growled, had not snapped, but the silence of its discipline was heavier than noise would have been. Around them, the town remained hushed. A car that had been idling down the block slowed and rolled past without looking. In the diner, a fork rested untouched on a plate, its owner frozen halfway through a meal. The tension on the corner was visible now, though the gang pretended it wasn't. They filled the air with louder jeers, mocking the blind man's stillness, mocking the dog's refusal to react. But beneath the laughter ran something thinner, a thread of unease stretched by the refusal of the animal to break posture. The biker straightened at last, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket, trying to look unaffected. Yet when he stepped back, his eyes flicked once more to the dog, as if checking to see whether it had turned away. It had not. Its gaze stayed fixed on him, unblinking, patient, as though it had already decided exactly what he would do next and was only waiting for the command to act. The silence between its breaths was sharper than any snarl, and though the gang tried to laugh over it, the sound of restraint carried heavier weight than their noise could hide. The noise of the gang folded around him like weather, but the old man did not shift. His hand stayed on the cane, the other brushing lightly across the harness strap, where the dog's steady presence waited. Behind his clouded eyes, the street disappeared. The laughter, the boots, the smoke. They blurred into the background as memory pressed forward with the clarity of a voice he had not heard in years. The silence he carried was not empty. It was filled with places and hours that had shaped him long before this corner, long before these men. He remembered the first day the dog had been paired with him, not in this quiet town, not in civilian clothes, but far from home, under a sky that seemed always dust-colored. The kennels had been loud with barking, metal gates rattling as handlers moved between rows. Soldiers stood back, waiting to be assigned, some shifting nervously, others pretending calm. He had stood among them, his rifle slung across his chest, sweat running into his collar despite the early hour. When a handler called his name, he stepped forward, and a black-coated dog was brought to him on a short leash. "This one's steady," the handler had said, his voice flat but certain. "Doesn't break, doesn't scatter. He'll read you quicker than you'll read him." The man had crouched then, letting the dog come closer, letting it sniff the dust and sweat of his uniform. The eyes that looked back at him were not wild. They were calm, focused, older than they should have been. In that moment, he had understood that this was not a pet, not a stray brought in and trained by chance. This was a partner. They had worked together through days that bled into nights, through convoys that rolled across nameless roads, through towns where every shadow might hold a weapon. The dog had walked ahead of him, nose pressed to ground, ears tuned to silence. It had frozen once outside a compound door, body stiff, tail straight, a growl pressed down into its chest. He remembered pulling back just as a charge detonated, the wave of heat and debris slamming into them. The dog had survived, singed and cut, one ear torn at the edge. The scar still marked it now, though the bikers circling them could not see its story. Later, in the long hours when nothing moved but the wind, he would sit with the animal beside him, both of them listening. Men spoke in whispers then, trying not to let their fear bleed out, but he found no need for words. The dog breathed steadily, chest rising and falling like the steady tick of a clock, and he matched his own breath to it. Together, they learned silence was not weakness. It was a form of strength that did not need to declare itself. When the blast that took his sight came, it was a dog's body pressed against his, dragging him back, pulling him towards safety even as he staggered in darkness that would never lift again. He remembered the handler's voice shouting through the ringing in his ears, the command to hold, the confirmation that both man and dog were alive. Afterward, when hospital walls replaced desert wind, it was the same dog that lay at the side of his bed, breathing slow, watching anyone who entered. Now, on the corner bench of a small town, surrounded by laughter that thought itself victorious, he felt the same quiet strength at his side. His hand rested over the harness, feeling the worn leather, the brass clip engraved with numbers that once matched a file thicker than a book. He knew what those numbers meant, though the men before him did not. To them, it was only a blind man and his animal. To him, it was a memory of a bond forged not in training manuals but in fire and blood, a bond etched so deep into silence that no mocking voice could touch it. The dog's head turned slightly as the men shifted, and for a brief second, the angle of its ear caught the pale afternoon light. The edge was not smooth. Where there should have been a natural taper fur, there was instead a jagged curve, a piece missing, the skin hardened into scar tissue. It was not the mark of clumsy handling or accident in a yard. It was a permanent signature of a moment that had nearly erased both man and animal. The scar had been carved years earlier in a place no one here would ever see. The explosion had torn through silence without warning, the blast wave lifting dust and stone into the air. The dog had been ahead of him, as always, nose to the ground, tether pulling forward, when the buried device tore open the road. He remembered the heat, the violent shift of air, the roar that left only ringing in its wake. When his hearing had returned in fractured pieces, he found his hands against the dog's body, feeling it trembling but alive, its ear torn and bleeding. Medics had patched what they could, but the ear would never be whole again. To those who trained them, scars were not hidden. They were records, etched in flesh, carried forward into every mission that followed. The handler had told him afterward that dogs like this carried the same burden as men. Memory in the body, discipline in the silence. The clipped ear became part of the dog's outline, something he could trace with his fingers in the dark when sight was no longer his own. That mark told him, wordlessly, that they had both survived what should have ended them. On Main Street, surrounded by laughter, no one in the circle noticed. They were too busy smirking, too busy feeding one another's bravado, to see the story carried in hardened tissue. To them, it was just an animal with a patch of uneven fur. But the dog's calmness, its refusal to shrink under the noise, was tied to that mark. It had already faced fire, already endured thunder louder than any motorcycle engine could produce. A circle of boots and cigarettes could not reach the place that scar had come from. The blind man's fingers brushed the edge of the dog's head briefly, passing across a line of hardened flesh. The motion was small, unnoticeable to anyone not watching closely. He did not flinch at the memory that surfaced. He only acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges an old comrade's presence in silence. His face remained still, his lips pressed, his chin tilted toward the faint sun. For him, the scar was not ugly. It was proof of endurance, of loyalty, of a bond that had carried both of them through walls of dust and into this quiet corner. The dog sat steady, posture unbroken, ears tuned to the shifts of weight in the ring around them. The clipped edge did not soften its hearing. If anything, it sharpened the contrast of sounds. Every scrape of a boot, every rattle of metal, every cough between laughs entered the animal's awareness. Its body remained calm, but the scar stood as a reminder. This was not a creature to be measured by leash or harness. It carried the battlefield in its very skin. The bikers, blind to what they mocked, saw only a quiet animal and an old man. They did not see the mark that spoke louder than words, a clipped ear that told of fire survived, of explosions weathered, of duty fulfilled. The scar bore no need for explanation. It was a record etched in silence, a history invisible to those who never thought to look. And so the dog waited unshaken, carrying both memory and readiness, and that small, jagged edge the gang could not comprehend. The circle of laughter around the bench blurred as the old man sat still, his hand resting lightly on the worn leather harness. He did not turn his head toward the voices or answer their taunts. Instead, memory carried him far from cracked pavement of Main Street to a place that smelled of iron and dust, where rows of kennels rattled with noise and the air seemed charged with anticipation. He remembered the voice of the kennel master, rough and steady, words spoken in the kind of tone that left no space for argument. "This one's not just a dog," the man had said, holding the leash with a grip that told of years in service. "He's a soldier who never left the field." At the time, the words felt like ceremony, a phrase meant to impress handlers and soldiers alike. But the truth of them revealed itself slowly, etched into every day that followed. He remembered the first time he saw the dog work, not in training, not in the comfort of controlled exercise, but in the field where shadows could carry death. The animal's body had gone rigid, ears forward, tail straight, blocking the path with unyielding stillness. A heartbeat later, the buried charge was found, its wires hidden beneath dust and stone. Men's lives had been spared because the dog did not treat silence as emptiness, but as warning. The kennel master had been right. This was not an ordinary animal, following instinct. There was thought behind its restraint, decision in its stillness. In those long nights under fractured stars, when distant artillery rattled the horizon, the dog lay close, its breathing even, its muscles taut even in sleep. It did not dream like other dogs. It watched, it listened, it kept the field within itself no matter where it was carried. The blind man remembered asking, once, how a creature could carry such weight without breaking. The master had looked at him with a tired expression, the kind of look that came from seeing too many tours, too many handlers lost before their dogs. "Some of them are built different," he had answered. "They don't come home, not really. They keep walking the field, even when the war's done. You'll see." He had seen. He had seen it in the way the dog never startled, never broke posture under gunfire, never panicked at the roar of helicopters or the thunder of charges. He had seen it in the clipped ear, the scar that spoke of fire and survival. He had seen it in the way silence never meant safety, but only the space between dangers. Even now, years and miles away, he felt it in the way the dog sat beside him, unflinching while boots and laughter circled. The bikers could not know the weight of the animal's calm. They saw only a blind man with his guide, imagining weakness in both. But the old man remembered the kennel master's words that had proven themselves again and again until they no longer sounded like praise but like fact. This was not just a dog. This was a soldier still holding the line, still carrying the field inside him. The bench, the cane, the small town street, none of it changed that truth. The man's fingers pressed briefly into the leather strap, an old acknowledgement of a bond that needed no voice. The world around him might laugh, but he sat within the memory of words that time had carved into certainty. The rhythm of their laughter shifted from amusement into something harder, sharper. The circle had grown tired of words alone. One biker, leaning against his machine with a cigarette dangling from his lips, picked up an empty bottle that had been rattling in the gutter. He weighed it in his hand for a moment, tossing it once into the air and catching it again, his grin widening as the others looked on. Without warning, he flicked his wrist and sent the glass spinning across the pavement. It clattered once, then shattered near the blind man's boots, fragments scattering across the ground in a sharp burst of sound. The noise cracked the corner open, echoing against the storefronts, drawing a few gasps from behind the diner window. Shards of green glass skittered across the man's worn shoes, one piece catching against the metal tip of his cane. Still, he did not flinch. His chin stayed lifted, his pale eyes unfocused but calm. His hand, steady on the cane, did not tighten. It was as if the bottle had never landed. The dog, however, moved, not in panic, not in a scramble of fear, but in a single controlled step. Its body shifted left, placing itself between the old man and the ring of boots. The harness creaked softly with emotion, leather stretching against scarred fur. Its ears twitched once toward the sound of the glass breaking, then forward again, marking the position of every man around them. The animal's tail did not tuck. Its body did not shrink. It stood angled, chest out, gaze sweeping across the circle in measured arcs. The bikers laughed again, though the sound came louder than before, as if they were forcing it. "See that? Even the mutton knows who's in charge," one called out, kicking a shard glass with the edge of his boot. But another glanced at the dog longer, noticing that its stillness was not cowering. The way it had stepped, the precision of its placement, was not instinct alone. It was position strategy, the act of putting its body where it belonged, between threat and master. The blind man lifted his hand briefly from the harness strap, brushing his palm across the dog's back in acknowledgement. His fingers found a ridge of scarred ear, pressed lightly, then settled again on the leather. He did not speak. He did not need to. The single step the dog had taken had already drawn the line that words could not. The bottle's fragments glistened on the ground, catching the dull light. Each shard seemed like a marker, a boundary drawn at the man's feet. The bikers shifted, boots crunching against the glass as they moved restlessly. The dog's head followed each sound, eyes tracking without hesitation. Its breathing was slow, even, the calm rhythm of something that had been trained to hold steady under worse than shattered glass. For a moment, the circle hesitated. The bravado that had carried them into laughter and noise thinned slightly under the weight of silence. The animal's posture unsettled them, though none would admit it. They wanted another reaction, something bigger, something to prove the blind man and his dog were nothing. Instead, they received a quiet step, precise and deliberate, that spoke louder than fear could. The street around them waited. Inside the diner, no one moved. Behind glass, eyes fixed on the bench, on the man who did not flinch and the dog who had claimed its place. The laughter picked up again, rougher, a cover against unease. Yet, beneath it, something had shifted. The challenge had been thrown with broken glass, and the answer had come not in panic, not in retreat, but in a step forward into silence, a barrier that could not be mocked away. The broken glass settled into silence, only the occasional crack as a shard shifted beneath a restless boot. The blind man lifted his cane slightly, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and lowered again with 2 deliberate taps against the pavement. The sound was quiet, yet it carried with weight far beyond its volume. To the bikers it meant nothing, only the idle action of an old man trying to assert presence he did not have. They laughed at the smallness of it, at the futility they imagined in his gesture. To the dog, the sound was different. It was a signal, a code written into rhythm, a language formed in places where words were dangerous to speak aloud. The dog's ears twitched toward the sound, its body responding instantly though subtly. Muscles shifted beneath its dark coat, weight sliding back into balance, legs angling in readiness. The harness creaked as its chest lifted, its breathing slowing into an even, deliberate cadence. To the gang it looked like nothing more than a nervous shuffle, the kind of posture they expected from an animal feeling cornered. They barked with laughter at the sight, the noise covering their own unease. Look at it. Thinks it's in charge now. One man jeered, slapping the arm of another as he spoke. Another leaned closer, mocking the rhythm of the taps with his boot, stomping twice against the pavement as if to imitate the sound. The rest roared the imitation, their voices filling the corner with the coarse energy of men who mistook cruelty for control. The blind man's face remained unchanged. His clouded eyes stayed lifted slightly toward the light, his jaw set in calm stillness. His hand lingered on the cane, fingers wrapped loosely around the handle. To anyone watching closely, the action did not look like accident or restlessness. It looked intentional, exact, as though those 2 taps had said everything that needed to be said. The dog's head turned slowly, scanning the circle of men with unbroken precision. Its gaze did not wander. Each sound of shifting boots, each scrape of leather against metal, was tracked in silence. Its tail did not wag. Its ears did not flatten. The stillness carried more weight than snarls could. For those who had served, for those who had seen working animals in fields where silence meant survival, the posture would have been unmistakable. But for these men, it was read as hesitation, as weakness waiting to be broken. They laughed louder, filling the air as if volume alone could drown the unease that rippled faintly beneath their bravado. A few stepped closer, careless with the space they invaded, confident that nothing sat between them and dominance but an old man and his mutt. Their voices grew rougher, their words sharper, feeding off one another as if daring the silence to answer. Still, the dog did not move beyond its shift into readiness. Its body remained perfectly aligned, prepared without revealing its purpose. The 2 taps echoed in its memory, as familiar as the commands once spoken through dust and fire. The discipline written into its muscles kept it steady, and the blind man's hand resting on the harness strap told it everything was as it should be. The corner held in tension, laughter clashing with silence, arrogance pressing against discipline. The bikers thought they had won in sound and presence. They mistook composure for fear, restraint for weakness. Yet in the quiet between their noise, the code of 2 simple taps had already drawn a line none of them could see. The dog knew it. The man knew it. And though the gang laughed, the weight of that silence remained, waiting to reveal itself when the moment demanded. The laughter carried on in uneven waves, coarse and careless, echoing off the storefronts like a sound too large for the narrow street. The gang fed on it, each voice sharpening the edge of the other, but at the center of their noise the old man sat unmoving. His body leaned slightly back against the bench, shoulders squared, his cane angled steady against his leg. His left hand rested lightly on the wooden slab beside him, palm open, fingers relaxed. It was not the hand of someone ready to strike, nor of someone reaching for help. It was still, as if the weight of years had taught it that movement was unnecessary. That stillness unsettled those who noticed it. A man circled closer, cigarette dangling from his lips, expecting some reaction as his boots crunched against the scattered glass. The blind man, did not turn his head. He did not raise his hand from the bench. He let the noise wash over him without answering it, without acknowledging it. The silence of that hand, its refusal to lift, spoke more clearly than words. He did not need to move. Beside him, the dog held the posture of restraint that came from training, not instinct. Its body leaned slightly forward, legs braced, ears sharpened toward every voice. The harness across its back shifted with each breath, but the animal did not break from its place. It waited, as it had been taught to wait, ready for the command that had already been given in a language beyond words. The 2 taps of the cane lingered like a note struck once and left to vibrate in the air. The man's hand on the bench had once been the hand that signed deployment orders, that carried letters home, that steadied a rifle under endless sun. It was a hand that had learned patience, that had learned silence was sometimes stronger than motion. In the field, unnecessary movement could give away a position, could invite disaster. He had carried that lesson home with him, folded into the rhythm of his body the way others carried scars. Now, surrounded by jeering men, that same stillness became his shield. The biker saw only an old man sitting passive, unwilling or unable to defend himself. Their laughter grew louder, mocking his calm. "Doesn't even twitch," one said, blowing smoke toward his face. "Probably too slow to lift a hand," another added. Their voices rippled with confidence, but a faint thread of doubt ran beneath it. If he was weak, why did he not shrink? If he was afraid, why did he not fumble? The absence of reaction weighed heavier than fear might have. The dog's eyes tracked each voice, pupils sharp, head turning in small, exact movements. Its muscles coiled under the still surface, the way rope tightens before holds. It needed no order beyond what it had already been given. The man's hand stayed on the bench, unmoved, because he knew motion was not required. The waiting had already been set in place. For the onlookers behind the glass of the diner, the scene was different than it was for the gang. They saw the steadiness, the composure, the quiet tether between man and animal. They understood, without fully knowing why, that his stillness was not surrender but control. The dog waited because the hand on the bench told it nothing more was needed yet. The gang's circle pressed closer, their bravado feeding itself, but the balance had already shifted. The blind man had not moved, had not raised his hand, and yet the dog was already braced, already listening, already deciding. The calmness of the man's still palm carried more command than raised voices ever could. And while the gang mistook that silence for weakness, the animal beside him knew the truth. Its master had already spoken, not with words or gestures, but with a discipline of stillness that had always been enough. The circle had grown restless. Their laughter, though still loud, carried an edge that betrayed impatience. Boots scuffed glass across the pavement, and one man rattled the chain at his belt for effect. Another clapped his hand sharply, leaning close to the blind man, as though daring him to react. Still the old man sat unmoving, his face tilted toward the pale light above, his hand resting calmly against the bench. The silence pressed harder against their noise, and what they mistook for weakness had begun to feel like defiance. It was then the dog broke the stillness, not with motion, not with a lunge or a bark, but with sound that rolled low and controlled from deep within its chest. The growl was not frantic, not wild. It was measured, deliberate, a line drawn across the air. The sound did not waver. It carried the weight of something that knew exactly what it was capable of and did not need to prove it yet. The gang fell momentarily quiet. The laughter trailed into uneven chuckles as their ears caught the difference. They had heard plenty of dogs growl before, yard dogs snarling from behind fences, strays snapping over scraps, mutts barking nervously at noise. This was not that. This was steady, unbroken, a sound more like a motor humming under restraint than an animal losing control. It was a kind of growl that told anyone listening it was not warning because it was afraid, but because it had already decided what it would do next if the line was crossed. The biker nearest to the dog froze mid-step. His boot hovered above the pavement before he shifted back, masking the motion by pretending to adjust his jacket. "Just a mutt," he muttered, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Another laughed to cover the silence, slapping him on the shoulder, trying to pull the tension back into mockery. But the growl continued, low and steady, vibrating to the ground in a way that unsettled those closest to it. The blind man did not move. His hand remained on the bench, his other on the harness strap, his face unchanged. He had heard that sound countless times before, in fields where the air smelled of dust and cordite, where silence could mean the difference between living and not returning. The growl was not threat to him. It was reassurance. It meant the dog was where it should be, seeing for him what his own eyes no longer could. A few of the bikers forced laughter again, louder this time, trying to smother their unease. One leaned forward and spat near the dog's paw, testing the boundary. The dog's eyes locked on him, the growl deepening in note, never breaking into bark or lunge. The precision of it made the act feel heavier than a snap of teeth would have. It was a sound of discipline, the line drawn and held, waiting for command. Behind the diner glass, people shifted nervously, forks forgotten, hands pressing against tabletops. They knew the tone, too. Some had served, some had family who had. They recognized the calm control in that low vibration, the unshakable warning that needed no explanation. The gang, blind to its meaning, laughed again, though uneasily. They mistook the restraint for hesitation, the control for weakness. But the line had already been marked. The growl told them exactly where it lay, and the silence of the man beside the dog told them it would not be moved. The laughter swelled again, covering the edges of unease that the growl had laid across the air. The men puffed themselves taller, louder, each voice trying to drown the low vibration that still hummed in the dog's chest. One of them, leaning forward with his hands on his knees, squinted at the collar strapped tight around the animal's neck. The brass tag caught what little light there was, its surface dull by years of wear. Beneath the scratches, a small emblem was pressed into metal, faint but deliberate, the kind of mark that was stamped, not etched by chance. The biker tilted his head, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. For a moment, his grin faltered, curiosity edging into his gaze. "What's this supposed to be?" he muttered, flicking a finger toward the tag without daring to touch it. The insignia was small, only a few lines of range of precision. A star, wings, and a number that belonged to a unit most civilians had never heard of. To the trained eye, it was unmistakable. To him, it was decoration, nothing more than a stylized trinket someone might pick up at a flea market. He shrugged, forcing his grin back into place. "Looks like a toy badge," he called over his shoulder, drawing laughs from the others. The explanation was easier to swallow than the possibility that it meant something heavier. None of them wanted to consider that the dog standing so still might not be ordinary, that the silence of the blind man beside it was anything but helplessness. The tag swayed slightly as the dog shifted its weight again, positioning itself more squarely between its master and the half-circle of boots. The faint lines of the insignia glinted once before falling back into shadow. The biker who had noticed it was already turning away, unwilling to look long enough to question what he had seen. He filled the gap with noise, clapping his hands together, mocking the old man for his silence. The blind man's hand brushed briefly across the harness strap, fingers grazing the tag. He did not need to see it to know it was there. He had traced those lines in the dark countless times, in hospital rooms, in quiet nights when he needed to remember who had pulled him back from fire. That insignia was not decoration. It was a record of service, of missions where silence had been more dangerous than gunfire. It was the proof of a bond recognized by those who trained them, those who deployed them, those who relied on them to walk back alive. But the bikers missed it. Their laughter filled the air, hollow and overdone, masking their own restlessness. They mocked what they should have questioned, dismissed what they should have feared. The insignia swayed again against the dog's chest, faint and nearly lost time, but unshaken in meaning. For the dog, it was nothing more than the weight it had always carried, the symbol that marked it as more than companion, more than animal. For the man, it was reassurance that his partner was still beside him, the same soldier who had never left the field. For the gang, it was an overlooked detail, a recognition missed, ignored in favor of arrogance. And because they missed it, they laughed louder, blind to the history resting quietly at the old man's feet, blind to the storm already waiting in silence. The circle thickened with noise again, the men feeding off each other's voices like a fire being stoked. The growl had faded back into silence, but its echo lingered just beneath the surface. Rather than acknowledge the unease it planted, the bikers turned to boasting, their words louder, harsher, crafted to reclaim the ground they felt slipping from beneath them. One spat on the pavement, smirking as he looked down at the dog. "Wouldn't take much to grab him," he said, his tone casual but edged. "One yank on that leash, and he's mine." He mimed a tug with his hand, earning laughter from the man beside him, who added quickly, "Could sell him, too. People pay stupid money for trained mutts." The thought turned into a story before it was even finished, each man adding his own spin. How easy it would be to break the dog, how much cash it could fetch, how amusing it would be to parade it around as theirs. The laughter was uglier now, less amused and more cruel, shaped into sharp edges that cut the air. Boots scuffed closer, glass cracking beneath heels, as if their words needed the weight of movement to prove them. One man bent down slightly, his grin wide as he stared into the dog's steady gaze. "But it wouldn't take long to beat the fight out of it," he muttered, knowing the others would pick up his cruelty and amplify it. They did. Another barked a mocking growl. Another slapped his thigh, as though calling the animal over, each trying to prove himself braver than the next. The blind man did not move. His hand stayed resting lightly on the harness strap, the other fixed on the handle of the cane. His pale eyes were angled toward the faint sunlight above, expression unreadable. To the bikers, his silence looked like defeat, as though he had given up defending what they threatened. But to those watching from behind the diner window, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like patience, the kind that weighed each moment without rushing to meet it. The dog remained fixed in place. Its breathing did not quicken. Its ears did not fold. It tracked the voices as it had all along, gaze following each speaker in precise arcs. Its body was braced now, angled slightly forward, every muscle coiled yet still. The boasting men saw none of this, or rather, they mistook it. They believed the stillness to be hesitation, the calmness to be weakness. They saw only what fit their narrative. A blind man unable to protect himself, a dog waiting to be taken. "Could turn it into a fighter," one of them said, his voice carrying more edge than just now. "Bet it'd tear through a ring if someone trained it right. Imagine the bets." His grin widened, his eyes narrowing with greedy speculation. The others chuckled at the thought, spinning it into jokes about blood and teeth. The blind man's fingers brushed the scarred edge of the dog's ear for a brief second, an acknowledgement of a bond no boasting could rewrite. He did not answer their threats, did not lift his head to speak. He let their words hang in the air, loud but hollow, filling space without substance. The dog remained the answer in silence, steady, waiting, carrying the weight of years that none of the men could comprehend. The circle laughed again, feeding on their own cruelty, confident in their imagined power. They did not see that their boasting was nothing more than noise against the patience of a man who had heard worse, against the discipline of an animal that had never broken. And as they mocked, the bench held steady, the cane stayed still, and the silence between man and dog carried more strength than their voices could ever drown. The noise swirled around the corner like smoke, thick with mockery and empty bravado. The men spat their boasts into the air, leaning on one another's words, each trying to sound sharper, meaner, more in control. Yet through it all the dog did not break its silence. Its body remained still, its breathing even, its chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. The only movement came in its eyes, dark and sharp, tracking every shift in the circle around it. The pupils narrowed and widened with precision, adjusting to each flick of a boot, each sway of a jacket. When a hand gestured, the eyes followed. When a chain rattled, the eyes locked to its sound as though it were an object in flight. It was not the wild stare of an animal overwhelmed by noise, nor the soft gaze of a pet seeking comfort. It was the stare of something trained to map the world, to anticipate threat, to hold its focus until commanded otherwise. It did not blink, not once, though cigarette smoke drifted past its face and laughter cracked the air inches from its ears. One biker, crouched low, noticed the stare directly and found himself unsettled by it. He leaned back, muttering, "Weird look on this one," but his words were drowned quickly by another's mocking laugh. The others had not seen it closely enough, had not recognized the difference in the eyes. To them, it was only a mutt staring dumbly at sound. But anyone who had stood beside working dogs in places where silence could explode into fire, the meaning was unmistakable. The eyes did not wander. They did not flick nervously. They held steady, marking every figure, every motion, like radar sweeping a field. The blind man's hand rested against the harness strap. His fingers curled loosely, but aware of the slight shifts in muscle beneath the dog's coat. He did not need his own eyes to know what his companion saw. The stillness told him, the tension and restraint, the way the animal leaned forward but not yet into action. He had felt it before, countless times, on roads where danger hid beneath sand, in alleys where shadows could hold a trigger. The dog was watching with that same shadow in its eyes now, the calm, unblinking knowledge of something that had survived worse than taunts and broken glass. The gang mistook it for obedience, for blankness. They filled the air with their laughter, blind to the weight in front of them. The dog had seen worse. It had seen men scream in fire, seen comrades dragged from dust, seen the aftermath of choices made too late. Compared to that, a ring of bikers with smoke on their breath was nothing more than noise. Its eyes reflected none of their power, none of their arrogance. Instead, they reflected patience, calculation, the shadow of memory etched too deep to be erased. The diner across the street watched in silence. Someone there noticed the eyes, though they could not name what they were seeing. They only felt the weight of it, the quiet gravity of an animal that did not break, did not look away. The dog blinked only once, slow and deliberate, before locking again onto the men who circled. The shadow in its eyes was not fear. It was history, and history was waiting. The ring of men had grown confident again, mistaking their noise for dominance. Their laughter carried over the corner in bursts, overlapping and ragged, as though each voice competed to be louder than the last. The blind man did not move, his hand still resting on the cane, his other resting lightly against the harness strap. The dog beside him breathed evenly, steady as a clock, but its eyes never left the shifting figures around them. Every scrape of a boot, every jingle of chain, every drag of a cigarette was marked in silence. One man decided words were no longer enough. He crouched low, lowering himself until his boots scraped the pavement inches from the scattered glass. The grin on his face carried bravado for the others watching, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. He reached out his hand slowly, fingers spread as though approaching a stray in an alley. He wanted to show the others how easy it was to bend this animal to his touch, to prove that the growl, the stillness, the unblinking eyes meant nothing. The dog's head followed the motion immediately. Its pupils tracked the hand not with panic, not with a twitching of fear, but with exact alignment, as though every joint in its body had been calibrated for this one act. Its ears turned toward the sound of knuckles cracking. Its chest shifted as air drew deeper into lungs. The movement was so controlled that it seemed almost mechanical, but beneath the skin was muscle wound tight, ready for release. The crouching man hesitated. He had expected a flinch, perhaps a bark or a shuffle backward. Instead, he found himself locked in a stare that did not blink, did not waver. The dog's head turned inch by inch, tracking his hand until it hung in the space between them. The silence in that narrow gap grew heavier with each second. He forced a grin to mask it, muttering under his breath, "Just a mutt." Yet the words carried less conviction than the smirk he plastered over them. The others laughed anyway, slapping one another on the back, urging him closer. "Go on," one jeered. "Show it who's boss." The crouched man pushed his hand forward another inch, but slower this time, less certain. The dog's muscles rippled under the harness, a subtle tightening that the blind man felt through the strap. He did not move his hand, did not give command. He knew the dog was already waiting, already ready. Every onlooker behind the diner glass leaned forward without meaning to, fork suspended, breath caught. They saw the stillness in the animal's body, the precision in its tracking. They saw how the biker's grin no longer reached his eyes. The hand hovered, and the dog's gaze never wavered, following it with surgical attention. Its breathing grew quieter, shallower, as though conserving energy for the next beat. The crouched man pulled back suddenly, pretending it was part of his game, pretending he had meant to stop there. He barked a laugh, louder than before, hoping it would drown the flicker of unease in his chest. The others joined him, careless and cruel. But the silence that had pressed into that narrow gap did not leave. It clung to the air, heavy and unshaken, as the dog lowered its head slightly and waited, every muscle set, every nerve alive, its eyes fixed still on a hand that had dared too close. The corner blurred into noise, boots dragging on pavement, laughter bouncing sharp against brick and glass. The blind man sat unmoving on the bench, but his mind slipped backward through the weight of memory. The circle of bikers faded, replaced by the roar of engines of another kind, heavier and filled with purpose. The acrid smell of smoke returned to him. The metallic sting of blood carried on the wind. His ears filled again with the sound of shouted orders cutting through chaos, words not meant to be questioned but obeyed at once. He remembered that day, the one carved deepest into him. The convoy had rolled through a stretch of broken road, dust rising behind them like a wall. The silence before it hit was strange, too perfect. Then the blast tore the earth open, lifting steel and men into the air. He had been thrown down, his rifle skidding from reach, his ears ringing so hard he thought he'd gone deaf. Dust choked the sky, and the ground trembled with fire. Through the ringing, one word cut clean. A soldier's voice, harsh, commanding, pulled from the center of the chaos. It was not his name, not even a sentence, just one word, sharp and clear, drilled into them from training and burned into him by survival. He could still hear it now, carried across years as if the speaker had never left. The word was not just a call. It was a line between chaos and control, between silence and action. The dog had heard it too that day. He remembered the animal jerking into position, muscles taut, ears pointed forward to the storm of sound. While men staggered and shouted, the dog had not hesitated. That single word had been enough. It charged forward where others faltered, dragging him clear of shattered metal, pulling him through smoke to a patch of ground still holding firm. Its body had braced against him, refusing to move until he caught his breath again, until the world stopped spinning. The memory was not only of the dog. It was of trust, of the bond that word carried. It was a sound that meant readiness, that triggered discipline rather than panic. He had felt it in his bones the moment it was spoken, and he carried it with him still, even now, years and continents away. Blindness had taken his sight, but not the echo of that voice. It had settled deep in him, a command he could recall without breath, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. On Main Street, laughter rose again around him, mocking, careless, but the blind man's hand rested lightly against a harness strap, fingers brushing the leather as if to remind himself that the word lived there too. The dog shifted slightly, breath slowing, body angled forward in the same poised readiness it had shown on roads far from here. It remembered as well. Behind his stillness, behind his unflinching silence, the old man held on to that echo. He did not need to shout. He did not need to explain. The word was already alive between them, a bridge across memory and time, waiting. The bikers, blind in their own way, laughed louder, mistaking patience for weakness. They could not hear what the old man carried in silence. The command remembered, the sound that had once steadied a battlefield and would steady this corner too, if the line was crossed. The noise of the street thickened with every passing second. Boots scuffed, laughter cracked, chains rattled as the gang filled the corner with the weight of their presence. Yet in the middle of that noise, the old man sat unmoving, his posture unbroken. His hand rested on the harness strap, steady as stone, his fingers curled loosely as though even time could not pry them loose. His pale eyes did not seek the faces around him. They stared past into nothing, as if the threats belonged to another world entirely. The bikers mocked louder, their words spilling over each other. Some spoke of money, others of breaking the dog, still others of dragging away just to see the old man stumble without it. Their voices rose with cruelty, echoing against storefront windows. But the man remained still, his lips pressed in until, without lifting his chin, he parted them. What left his mouth was not a shout, not a plea, not even a word meant for the ears circling him. It was soft, quieter than the grind of glass beneath their boots. One word, carried in breath alone, slipped into the narrow space between him and the dog. A word born long ago on roads filled with dust and smoke, spoken first by soldiers who did not weigh syllables. The gang did not hear it. Their laughter swallowed it whole. but the dog did. Its ears pricked at once, body tightening as though the sound had struck muscle rather than air. The change was immediate, though barely seen. The dog shifted forward a fraction, weight settling onto its front legs, eyes narrowing as it fixed fully on the closest figure. Its chest expanded once, slow and deep, then stilled again, holding the energy coiled within. To the bikers, the animal looked unchanged, still sitting at its master's side. They missed the subtle way its stance had shifted, the readiness that now pulsed beneath the surface. The blind man's hand remained resting, not tightening, not urging. He had given the only signal required. The rest was already in the bond between them, a bond honed in places where hesitation was fatal. He breathed once more, slow and calm, as though the command had been nothing more than an exhale. Behind the diner glass, someone noticed. A woman setting down her coffee froze when she saw the dog's posture change, its head lowering slightly, its eyes locked in a way no pet ever looked. She pressed her hand against a window without meaning to, as though the thin pane of glass could bridge her to what she saw. Others leaned forward too, sensing the moment, but not hearing the word that had triggered it. The bikers laughed still, jeering, one clapping his hands inches from the dog's ears, expecting it to flinch. It did not. The growl returned, quieter this time, rumbling under its breath like a current moving underground. The men mistook the calm as hesitation, mocking it all the louder. But in truth, the decision had already been made. The one word whispered into the air remained between the old man and the dog, unheard by all others. It was a switch thrown, a memory awakened, a command carried through years of service and survival. The gang laughed on, blind to the change before them. Only the dog knew, and only the dog was ready. The moment stretched thin, pulled tight by the old man's whisper, a thread of sound lost in the noise, yet caught perfectly by the ears that mattered. The bikers carried on, laughing, clapping, jeering, circling as though the silence on the bench meant surrender. One crouched too near again, hands swinging low with a careless swagger, his fingers reaching to test what he believed was nothing more than a harmless pet. His grin was wide, his voice taunting, but the sound broke off halfway when the dog moved. It was not a lunge, not the reckless explosion of an animal losing control. It was sharp, precise, like a machine responding to a signal. The dog's muscles coiled and released in a single motion, its head snapping forward with speed too quick for the eye to follow. Its jaws clamped around the biker's wrist, teeth locking down with a pressure that stopped bone but did not shatter it. The sound of contact was not a crunch but a thud, the snap of impact controlled into place. The man gasped, stumbling backward, his voice cutting into a cry that was half rage, half shock. The others shouted at once, their laughter breaking into curses, boots scraping as they lurched forward. But before the circle could collapse, the dog released. Just as suddenly as it had struck, it let go, retreating one step back toward the bench, body braced, ears forward. There was no wild thrashing, no chase. Only precision, discipline, and a quiet readiness to move again, if needed. The biker clutched his wrist, staring at the mark of teeth pressed deep into his skin. Blood welled, but the bone held. Enough to wound pride, not to end the hand. He staggered, his grin gone, his face twisted between pain and disbelief. "What the—" he started, but the words caught, choked by the silence that had followed. The gang hesitated. They had expected chaos, barking, flailing, something to confirm their mockery. Instead, they had seen a strike, so clean it looked rehearsed, a movement more like a drill than an attack. It unsettled them. One muttered, "That wasn't normal," and another tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked in his throat. Behind the diner glass, the onlookers pressed closer. They had seen the difference. This was not the snapping of a cornered animal. This was control, a fury restrained by training, a strike that spoke a discipline learned in fields far away from this small town street. They exchanged glances, silent recognition forming without words. The blind man sat unchanged, his hand steady on the harness strap. He did not speak, did not move, but the faintest shift in his lips suggested he knew exactly what had happened, knew that his partner had obeyed the command exactly as intended. He did not need to watch to understand the rhythm of that moment. He had lived through it before, in places where such precision was the difference between life and death. The biker holding his wrist cursed again, louder this time, but the anger did not disguise the fear edging into his voice. He had been touched by something beyond his comprehension, something that had chosen to wound and not destroy. He looked at the dog and saw no wildness, no foam or rage. He saw eyes steady and unblinking, waiting for the next signal. The gang shifted uneasily, their bravado thinning. They had wanted a show of weakness, but what they had received was a display of control sharper than any blade. The silence after the strike weighed heavier than all their noise, and the dog stood ready, calm, precise, waiting for the word again. The air changed the moment the wrist came free. The biker staggered back, clutching at the red mark sinking into his skin. His voice caught somewhere between rage and disbelief, but he did not move forward again. None of them did. For the first time since they had roared onto the street, the engines were silent, the laughter gone. The corner that had been filled with their noise fell into a stillness. So sudden it rang louder than any mockery could. The circle broke, without anyone deciding it should. Boots scraped backward across glass, the rough scrape of leather on pavement, sounding more cautious than bold. Shoulders that had leaned forward minutes before now shifted away, uncertain. Eyes darted between the injured man and the animal that had struck without hesitation, and returned to stillness just as quickly. The dog stood back a heel, its body steady, its chest rising and falling in the same slow rhythm as before. It did not lunge again, did not bark, did not chase. It waited unshaken, as though nothing had happened. The blind man had not moved through it all. His hand still rested calmly on the harness strap, his other on the cane, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something far beyond the noise of the street. His face gave no sign of triumph or fear. He sat as he had before, unmoved, unflinching, steady. To the gang, it made the silence heavier. To those watching from the diner window, it made the moment feel larger than itself, like a story unfolding that everyone would remember. The biker with the wounded wrist cursed under his breath, shaking his hand as if that might erase the marks. He wanted to shout, to lunge again, to prove it had been nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked to the dog and lingered there too long. He saw no retreat in its stance, no apology in its eyes, only that same steady focus, the shadow of something trained beyond his understanding. His anger collapsed inward, leaving him silent like the rest. The others tried to recover their bravado, but their voices cracked when they tried to laugh. One muttered, "It's just a dog," but the words rang empty, even to him. Another spat on the pavement, aiming for disdain, but hitting the ground too close to his own boot. They had mocked, circled, jeered, but now none of them stepped forward. Their engines stayed cold, their noise smothered by the weight of stillness. They did not know how to answer. The dog shifted only once, a small step closer to the man on the bench, head angled forward as though confirming the perimeter was clear. Its ears twitched, then settled. Its body eased slightly, but the control remained unbroken. To anyone watching closely, it was obvious the animal had not acted out of instinct. It had obeyed. It had struck with precision and returned to calm, the discipline etched into its very movement. Inside the diner, chairs scraped back as people leaned closer to the window. No one spoke. The moment did not invite words. They watched the silence hold, saw the gang standing there with all their weight and noise stripped away, saw the old man and his dog sit steady at the center of it. For the first time, the biker seemed smaller than the bench, smaller than the dog resting at heel. The blind man's lips parted just slightly, though no sound followed. He did not need to speak. The silence itself was enough. The gang, once so loud, had been pulled into it against their will. They stepped back, still muttering, still trying to pretend control, but the truth was written across their faces. They had not broken the man. They had not broken the dog. And now, with engines off and laughter gone, it was clear to everyone on that street who had been in control all along. The biker with the injured wrist kept shaking his hand, as though motion alone might erase the punctures pressed deep into his skin. He hissed through his teeth, muttering curses, his voice stripped of the laughter it had carried moments before. Around him, the others shifted uneasily, boots scraping against the pavement, glances darting from his wrist to the dog that now sat steady once more at the blind man's side. The silence was heavy, and in the absence of noise, details began to surface, details they had ignored before. One of the men noticed the collar first. The brass tag caught a slice of afternoon light, glinting faintly through the haze of smoke and dust. What had been dismissed earlier as decoration now seemed to carry weight. The injured man's hand brushed against it in his anger, and the tag swung forward. Its surface turned plainly to the rest of them. The lines, though worn by years, were unmistakable once they were seen clearly, a stamped insignia above a series of numbers, not random, not decorative, ordered, deliberate. The group leaned in slightly. Their noise gone, curiosity tugging the edges of their arrogance. One muttered, "Wait, hold up, what's that say?" Another bent closer, squinting. He rubbed at the brass with his thumb, clearing the grime just enough to make the digits show sharper. His voice dropped, losing the bravado it had carried before. That's a unit number." For a moment, no one answered. The words seemed to hover in the space between them, heavier than the threats they had been tossing back and forth minutes earlier. Someone finally exhaled hard, half a laugh, half disbelief. "You kidding? That's military? On a dog?" The question hung without answer, but the doubt was already planted. Another biker, older than the rest, leaned in further. His eyes lingered on the insignia longer than the others, and his face shifted in a way they all noticed. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't sneering. He knew what he was looking at. "I've seen that before," he said quietly, his voice rough. "Back when my brother came home. He told me about dogs that were trained like soldiers. Dogs with tags, numbers, collars like this one. They weren't pets. They weren't for show. They were partners." The silence thickened as the weight of his words settled on the group. The biker with the injured wrist shifted uncomfortably, his bravado dissolving into unease. He muttered again, but this time not loud enough for the others to pick up. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed it harder against his wound. The dog sat unmoving, its head angled just enough to keep the men in its line of sight. The insignia on its collar glinted once more, an unspoken record of service and history that none of them had been prepared to face. It was no longer a mutt to be mocked, no longer a prize to be stolen. The number changed everything. It told a story without words, one they could not laugh away. Behind the diner glass, the onlookers leaned closer, faces pressed a window. Some recognized it too. One man mouthed the number silently, his lips tightening as if remembering something he'd rather forget. Another shook her head slowly, a hand pressed to her chest. They understood what the bikers were only beginning to grasp, that the animal at the blind man's side was not ordinary. The gang shifted back a step, not out of decision but instinct, each man trying to reconcile what they had just seen. The injured biker let out a shaky breath, eyes fixed on the collar. The engraved number had revealed what mockery had hidden until now. This was not weakness sitting on the bench. This was discipline, history, and service forged into silence. And someone, finally, had recognized it. The number lingered in the air even after the collar had stopped swaying. It glinted faintly in the shifting light. And though the digits were few, their weight pressed hard on those who saw them. One biker kept staring, lips moving as if trying to memorize the sequence. Another looked away, unsettled, but the silence between them cracked when the older man in the group spoke again. His voice carried not with bravado, but with something heavier, something close to respect. "I know that tag," he said, quieter than the engines that had brought them there, quieter even than the broken laughter that had now completely died away. "That number, it matches the dogs they deployed overseas. Iraq, Afghanistan, my brother told me." His words drew every eye, even from those pretending not to listen. For a moment, no one replied. The sound of traffic blocks away filled the gap, ordinary life brushing against the edge of what had suddenly become extraordinary. Finally, one of the younger bikers scoffed, but his voice cracked against the silence. "So what? It's just a number on a collar." Yet even he did not sound convinced. His eyes kept darting to the animal, steady and unflinching, sitting perfectly at the side of the blind man. The older one pressed on. "These weren't pets. They were soldiers. They went on tours, same as the men. Some of them ran into fire, cleared buildings, tracked explosives. They trained for years, more disciplined than most people ever had. His words pulled the silence tighter. For the first time, the gang's arrogance faltered not because of a growl or a snap, but because of knowledge. Inside the diner, whispers stirred. A man at the counter murmured, "That's AK-9 tag. My cousin worked with them." A woman leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The story had already begun to spread, leaping from table to table, carried on low voices. People nodded, recalling headlines and homecomings, remembering ceremonies where dogs with similar tags had stood beside soldiers, their names read aloud, their service recorded in official ledgers. Back on the street, the gang stepped back again, this time not from instinct alone, but from something closer to fear. The man with the injured wrist kept staring at the number as though it had marked him more deeply than the bite itself. His pride was wounded, but something else was breaking through the anger. He had not been attacked by a mutt. He had been touched by a record of service, by history carried in scar and steel. The blind man sat as he had all along, unmoving, his hand resting lightly on the harness strap. He did not speak, but his silence now carried an answer none of the bikers could laugh away. He had no need to boast or explain. The number had spoken for him. It told the story of his companion, a soldier's partner, a veteran in his own right, a being trained in the hardest crucible war could offer. The recognition spread further with every breath. Military K-9 units, dogs had gone overseas, returned home carrying memories no one could erase. The diners behind glass, the bikers on the street, even the passers-by who had slowed to watch, they all began to see it differently. The harness was no longer a leash. The tag was no longer a trinket. The dog was no longer an animal to mock. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Heavier than laughter. Heavier even than the growl that had cut through earlier. It was a silence of realization, of words spreading quickly, of recognition settling in. The number on the collar had unlocked it. This was not weakness before them. This was a veteran's record. Standing firm in fur and muscle, silent but undeniable. The diner had gone still long before the gang realized it. Forks rested half-raised. Cups sat untouched, and every eye was drawn to the window. People had watched as the noise outside turned to silence, as bravado gave way to something else, something heavier. When the engines first cut, the quiet inside the diner felt like an echo, as though even the clatter of plates would have been disrespectful to what had just unfolded on Main Street. The waitress lingered near the counter, her order pad resting idle in her apron. She had been the first to notice the shift in the dog, the way its posture had changed when the old man whispered. She had watched every second with a stillness she didn't know she carried, her pen hanging in the air, the coffee pot cooling in her hand. When the collar glinted and the number was read aloud, she had not needed anyone to explain. She had heard stories, the kind passed from uncles and cousins who had served, the kind whispered at funerals where flags were folded and handed off without words. Now, as the gang stepped back into their own silence, she set the pot down carefully and moved to the corner of the counter. A book lay there, leather cracked, its pages filled with the handwriting of years. The town's ledger was never official, never sanctioned, but it carried more weight than most records. Waitresses, clerks, barbers, shopkeepers, each kept it going, line by line, a memory of what the town had seen, of what it refused to let pass unmarked. She flipped it open to the day's page, past notes about a farmer's overdue order, past mention of the morning storm that had rattled the shutters. She uncapped her pen, the page wide beneath her hand, and paused before writing. Her eyes lifted once more to window. Outside, the blind man remained seated, unchanged, his hand still steady on the harness strap. The dog sat at his heel, silent, unshaken. The gang had stepped back, their bravado gone, their engine still. Her pen touched the page, the scratch of ink quiet against the hush. For words, simple, unadorned, bench, blind man, K9. She hesitated, then added the last two, bikers silenced. She did not dress it in detail, did not need to. The ledger was not for stories. It was for memory. Anyone who opened the book years from now would see those words and understand that something had happened, something worth carrying forward. The bell over the diner door jingled softly as a late customer entered, but even they felt the weight of the silence and lowered their voice without being asked. The waitress closed a ledger gently, her hand resting on its worn cover for a moment before sliding it back to its place beneath the counter. The act was small, almost invisible, yet it carried the same weight as the dog's silence outside. It was not noise that recorded the moment, not shouts or boasts. It was ink on paper, a quiet note in a book that never shouted. The ledger had held births, deaths, storms, small acts of kindness, and the rare flashes of cruelty that shaped the town. Now it held this: the bench, the blind man, the dog that had once worn a soldier's number, and the gang that had laughed until silence broke them. The waitress picked up her pot again, moving back to refill cups, her face calm but her eyes brighter. She knew the town would keep talking, but long after the voices faded, the ledger would remain. On that page, in those few words, the truth was written. The silence on Main Street held longer than any of the bikers wanted. Their noise had been stripped from them, replaced by the steady breathing of a dog that did not flinch and the still figure of a blind man who had never once risen from the bench. The engines that had once shaken windows now sat cold, the air heavy with smoke that drifted without purpose. The men shifted, restless, searching for a way to reclaim what had slipped, but nothing in their laughter seemed strong enough anymore. It was the youngest who moved first, his pride wounded deep in his friend's wrist. He broke the stillness by swinging a leg over his bike. The machine groaned to life with a rumble, but even that sound felt subdued, as if muffled by the weight of what lingered in the air. He revved it once, not with the reckless sharpness from before, but softly, almost apologetically, the growl of the engine carrying none of the confidence it once had. The others looked at him, waiting for someone to fill the space with words, with bravado, but no one did. Their boots shifted against the pavement instead, scraping glass and dirt, their bodies angled back toward their machines. The circle they had formed so confidently began to loosen, edges unraveling with every step. They shuffled back, eyes darting toward the bench, toward the dog that still sat steady, watching unblinking. The man with the bitten wrist muttered under his breath, though no one caught the words. His hand was still pressed hard against the marks, his shoulders tense. When one of the others gestured toward him, he shook his head quickly, unwilling to meet their gaze. The bite had not broken bone, but it had broken something else, his certainty. No more jokes rose from their throats. No mocking laughter cracked the air. They were men used to filling silence with noise, to bending fear with cruelty. But now even their voices betrayed them. The words they wanted to speak felt hollow before they reached their lips. Instead, they turned toward their bikes, boots dragging as if weighted. Another engine turned over, then another, each one catching with a sound too small for the swagger they had carried before. The roar of machines, once a weapon of intimidation, now sounded subdued, stripped of menace. Each man moved slower than he might have liked, climbing back onto the seats, hands fumbling briefly over grips and levers. Their retreat was not announced, not demanded. It was simply taken, step by step, until the bench and the dog were no longer surrounded but left in open air once more. Inside the diner, no one spoke. The watchers pressed close to the glass could see it plainly. The shift of posture, the fading of arrogance, the quiet admission in the way the gang retreated. They had come loud, but they were leaving smaller. The blind man did not move, did not even lift his head. His stillness was victory enough. The first bike rolled forward, tires crunching over broken glass. It did not lurch with aggression, did not roar down the street. It eased away, slow and measured. The others followed, the sound of their engines layering but never climbing into the defiant thunder they were known for. It was the sound of men leaving with nothing left to prove, nothing left to say. The dog shifted only once, a small adjustment at the man's heel, eyes tracking until the last of them pulled away from the corner. Its body relaxed slightly but never fully. Its discipline held to the end. And when the final bike turned out of sight, the silence returned heavier than before. The gang was gone not by fight, not by force, but by the quiet command of presence they could not overcome. The The last of the engines faded down Main Street, their low growls swallowed by distance, leaving only the ordinary sound of town life creeping cautiously back in. A door opened somewhere far off, a screen door that squeaked and shut again. A truck rolled slowly across an intersection blocks away. But on the corner itself, silence lingered like smoke after fire, heavy and reluctant to move on. The old man sat as he had throughout it all, posture unchanged, his hand still resting on the harness strap. His pale eyes remained lifted toward nothing, unbothered by the stares of those who had watched from behind glass. For a long moment he did not stir, as if waiting for the street itself to breathe again before he chose to. The dog remained fixed at his side, ears tilted forward, body balanced in perfect stillness, the faint tension in its muscles uncoiled only by inches. Then, slowly, the man shifted. His fingers slid from the harness strapped to the cane, curling around the handle worn smooth by years of use. He drew in a breath, steady and deliberate, and leaned forward just enough to lift himself from the bench. His movements carried no rush, no display of triumph or fatigue. They were careful, precise, the practiced rise of someone who had learned to move with patience rather than speed. When he stood, the cane angled toward the pavement, hovering a fraction above the ground. He paused, letting his weight balance, then tapped once. The sound was small, a single knockwood against stone, but it rang through the silence like a note struck on a bell. It was not signal for the town, not announcement for the onlookers. It was meant for one alone. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, its head lifted slightly, gaze sweeping forward, then back to its master. Without hesitation, it stepped once ahead, its movements as calm as they had been from the beginning. The leash remained slack, the harness shifting only gently as the animal took its place in front. There was no pull, no jolt. It guided, steady and sure, as it had always done, its discipline unbroken by the noise that filled the street moments earlier. The man tilted his head, listening not to the voices still murmuring from behind the diner glass, but to the faint rhythm of paws against pavement. His hand rested on the cane, his other on the strap, trusting the guidance without question. Together, they moved from the bench, the old wood creaking softly as it was left behind. The corner that had been crowded minutes before now felt wider, the space reclaimed not by force but by the slow return of footsteps. The watchers behind the window did not cheer, did not clap. They simply followed with their eyes, silent as the man and his dog crossed the glass-littered pavement. The single tap of the cane had spoken more than any word could have. It told them the moment was over. It told them that life, steady and measured, was moving forward again. The dog led, calm as ever, its focus unbroken, its patience endless. The man followed, each step sure though his eyes never saw. One tap of the cane, one quiet lead forward, and the street returned to itself, marked forever by the silence that had driven the bikers away. The street did not fill again with noise once the bikers were gone. Instead, the quiet stretched across Main like a new coat of paint, still wet, still holding shape. The air carried the faint scent of exhaust fading into distance, the sharper tang of glass ground under boots, but no sound rose to replace the engines. For a few breaths, it was only the tap of the cane and the steady rhythm of paws that moved through the corner. Then doors began to open. The first was the diner's, the bell above it ringing soft, cautious, as if even it knew not to disturb what lingered. A man in a flannel jacket stepped onto the sidewalk, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the space where the circle had been. He did not speak. He only looked, then dipped his chin once toward the blind man's back as it receded slowly up the block. Across the street, a hardware store door opened, and an older woman came out with her arms folded across her apron. She had watched from the window the whole time, her breath fogging the glass, her knuckles pressed white against the counter. Now she stood in the open air, her lips parted as if to say something, then closing again. She nodded once firm, as though she'd spoken aloud anyway. More followed, shapes stepping into daylight from doorways, leaning out of windows, leaving counters untended. They had all witnessed it, each from their own vantage point. They had seen the laughter turn, the arrogance collapse, the silence win. And though their voices carried no cheer, no applause, the weight of their quiet said enough. Heads turned to one another, Nods passed like handshakes, small gestures that carried more strength than words could. Respect began to take root where mockery had once been. A young man who had smirked from his place inside the diner now stared at the bench left behind, his jaw tight, no humor left in his face. A woman who had once flinched at the sound of shattering glass now stood straighter, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes glistening not from fear, but from something steadier. A mechanic from the corner garage, rags still slung over his shoulder, muttered under his breath, "Seen enough," though no one had asked him. The blind man did not look back. He walked slowly, cane tapping lightly, the dog guiding forward with the same calm it had carried through everything. He did not need to turn to know they were watching. He did not need to hear their words to know what had shifted. Respect lived in silence, and silence was a language he understood best. The bench remained, a shard of glass catching light at its foot, the faint imprint of presence still clinging to the wood. People glanced at it as they passed, some pausing just long enough to register it, others avoiding it altogether as though it were sacred. They all knew what had happened there, and they all knew it would be spoken of long after the moment itself had ended. Voices began to murmur softly at last, low and careful. "Did you see? The dog, trained military. Didn't even flinch." The words carried from one to another, each told quieter than the last, until the whole block seemed wrapped in a hush that carried the same story. No one laughed now. No one mocked. The tone had changed permanently, etched into the street like a mark that would not fade. Respect replaced laughter, not by decree, not by demand, but by the witness of what had unfolded. And as the man and his dog disappeared further up the street, the town remained watchful, their silence binding them tighter than any sound could. The days that followed carried on much the same as before, at least on the surface. The town moved through its routines. Trucks unloading at the hardware store, children darting across the square with backpacks bouncing, the smell of fried food spilling out of the diner at noon. But the bench on Main was no longer ordinary. People glanced at it differently now, with a quiet kind of acknowledgement. They did not linger, did not speak about it openly, but the memory of what happened there clung to the wood, and the ground beneath it like a shadow that refused to lift. The blind man returned, as he always did. He found his place on the bench in the mid-morning. Kane sat carefully at his side, his hand resting on the worn strap of the harness. The dog lay close, paws folded, head lifting at the sound of every passing engine, but never flinching, never shifting beyond what was needed. Its calm presence seemed to extend across the corner itself, as if the street belonged to the pair by unspoken right. Engines came and went. Motorcycles passed sometimes, their pipes splitting the air, but none slowed near the bench. The riders kept their speed, faces turned forward, hands steady on their grips. Some of the same men who had once circled, their noise filling the air with arrogance. Now they rode past without glance or word, their silence louder than their engines had ever been. Others, strangers just moving through town, felt the tension in the air without knowing why. They sensed something the way the street hushed as they approached, and they did not dare break it. Inside the diner, regulars spoke in low voices, retelling the scene to those who had missed it. But even in retelling, their tones stayed hushed. The story belonged to the bench now, not to the chatter of the tables. The waitress who had written in the ledger flipped back to the page more than once, her finger brushing the ink she had set down. Bench, blind man, K9, biker silenced. She had not added more in the moment, but she knew another note would be needed. That afternoon, after the man and his dog had left, she returned to the ledger, pen in hand. She opened to the new page, the one for that day, and paused as she always did before writing. She had seen him again, cane tapping once, the dog guiding with patience, and she had seen the way the town responded. No engine stopping, no laughter carried down the street, just respect, quiet and heavy, the kind that did not need to be spoken. She bent to the paper and wrote, "Known, trained, silence greater." The words were spare, but they carried what mattered. Known, because the secret of the dog's number was no longer hidden, because the truth of its history had spread to the town in whispers. Trained, because discipline had spoken louder than noise, precision louder than cruelty. Silence, greater, because that was what remained: the absence of mockery, the absence of challenge, the presence of something that commanded without demand. The ledger closed again, its cover warm but firm, holding the moment within its pages. Outside, the bench sat empty now, but the mark of presence lingered. Another day would come, and the old man would return with his dog, as steady as ever. Engines would pass, and none would dare stop. The town would watch, as it had before, keeping the silence that had been won, not by force, not by noise, but by the quiet strength of a man and his companion who needed no words at all.